cows are herbivores, aren't they?
Yep.
I knew it. So that means when you eat beef, you're actually eating both meat and vegetables.
Isaac, you are so smart!
Aren't I?
Anime is pretty closely associated with Japan, which is one of the reasons why people might be adverse to watching it dubbed in a different language. After all, wouldn't that dilute the flavor of the setting or style? This might sound surprising coming from us, but honestly, there's nothing wrong with that reasoning. As long as you're not a dick about it. It'd be pretty easy to bring up Western-inspired anime as an argument against that worldview, but I don't think it's that simple.
So, explain to me why a gang of criminals is coming and going at this place.
You know what we are? Brutal thugs!
Brutal thugs!
Sometimes I feel like the English dub for Baccano is praised simply by virtue of the story taking place in America, as opposed to English-speaking fans seeing it as the definitive version because it holds up over a decade later.
You've only got this one chance, kid. Make me laugh or make me angry, and that will decide whether you live or die.
What a wretched bastard.
There's no need for anyone to die!
It's too late now. There's no going back.
The EDR team pulled from almost every element of the show possible to try to make the experience immersive. So let's see how well that experience holds up. In the original version, all the characters obviously speak Japanese, complete with Japanese linguistics, mannerisms, and even a few cultural references, with one minor character potentially being Japanese himself. Americans of the Prohibition era didn't commonly talk like this, and unfortunately, not even the visuals of Baccano are immune to linguistic troubles.
なあミリア、チェス君は一体何に怯えてるんだろうな。
不死者の者は人間ってことだね。
じゃあこの不死ってのはなんだ？
不死だらの不死だね。
ってことは不死だらな人ってことか。そいつは無理もないな。
しかも影だからね。
Common Japanese pronouns like Nissan or honorifics like Dono are freely used to highlight character relations to each other with minimal dialogue.
エニスお姉ちゃん、僕ちょっとこのお姉ちゃんとお話ししてくるよ。ありがとうございました。いや、ありがとう、チェス君。
As the ADR director, Tyler Walker understood direct translations like Big Brother for Onisan might stick out to an English-speaking audience, because we don't often refer to others the same way a Japanese person might. I mean, the way Graham refers to Lad as Boss Lad does stand out in that regard, but that's far from the only thing that stands out about Graham. English dubs in general have varying and inconsistent standards when it comes to this stuff, but for this setting and era in particular, it would be jarring. The EDR team actively took steps to give the show a distinct sound that potentially couldn't be done in the original as an important larger goal. Sometimes this was done in subtle ways that weren't always necessary, and not all of them make sense. Like, I'm not 100% sure why John or Johan is called Ian in the dub. However, one targeted means of accomplishing this goal that seems to stick with fans the most was the accents and period-specific slang, with snappy, punchy dialogue to help the setting feel more lived in. Anime dubs have had a rocky relationship with accents over the years.
I don't know. I'd feel bad making his little lordship start to cry.
See, they're all pointy up and wiggling unlike they were before. Getting that way when I'm happy or excited, and I haven't been either in a very long time.
I'd hoped to be able to watch you a little while longer than this, but that's quite enough for today.
But who cares if she does, because before we go home, we're going to have some fun in Paris.
Because the dialogue and performances are adapted from pre-existing dialogue and performances, it's not always easy to know how to implement accents, because the aesthetics associated with them aren't always present in Japanese voiceover.
That gink you picked up earlier. Dead yet?
Now that's a good-looking doll.
The boss of the goons giving the Russo family trouble is just some snowed-up gunslinger.
Here in Baccano, the authenticity of these accents and the frequency of certain slang can be a source of understandable contention, especially when compared to how people might have actually talked during the time periods and locations the show highlights.
Some may say it's a good change, others may say it's a bad change.
Whether or not you're a fan of them, maybe it's important to remember that the series isn't a realistic portrayal of how people acted during this time, but rather a stylized imagining.
I mean, when you think of like a gangster movie, right? So you have the gangster movie, which is a heightened reality, right? And then you make that in a cartoon, and then the heightened reality or the kind of disconnect from the real world is amplified. So you're doing a cartoon version of a heightened reality. So it gives us a little more leeway to go really big or to kind of, or to be more conscious of what we're doing. And I wasn't necessarily as concerned with things being super regional. You know, I wanted it to sound like a gangster movie. I wasn't thinking like, you know, well, this person's from this area of New York and this person's, you know, he's from Chicago. And, you know, there's a little bit of that, but, you know, mainly you just kind of want it to sound like that period and like the genre. Like there's a certain sound to the genre.
Granted, that approach might not be enough for people, and even then, it only really applies for the characters in 1930s New York.
All I had to do was make that crabby bunch smile, eh?
And as long as I remain with you, I know there is nothing to be afraid of.
This is not a question that we will find the answer to among ourselves today.
Original Baccano author Ryogo Narita did extensive research on American gangster and pop culture, with Capone, the man of the era, and the Untouchables being key inspirations. The latter's portrayal of the ongoing battle against corruption during the Prohibition era might have even influenced one of the main villains being a ringleader for an underground organization, who spends most of the show trying to acquire bottles that many people mistake for alcohol. Heck, alcohol was so sought after by some people in this time that it might as well have been the elixir of life. And the 5 rival mafia families in the series appear to mirror the real 5 rival gangs that were competing for control in New York in the early 1900s. Tyler made note of this, but also did his own additional research into other films in an attempt to capture a very specific linguistic flavor, urging the staff to watch films as well when they had the time. He looked into acclaimed gangster films like Miller's Crossing, and even noticed that Lad's uncle strongly resembled Johnny Caspar, reworking his performance and slang to emulate him.
If it'll help you think, you should know that if you don't do this thing, you're not gonna be in any shape to walk out of here.
The high-grade parts are being swapped out with cheap crap and sold on the black market.
Miller's Crossing is a very stylized gangster flick. It's, you know, the Coen brothers, so that the dialogue is really, really on point.
No one that ain't got ethics.
What about the fighters you pay to tank out?
We only pick fighters we know we can put the fear of God in.
While also looking at films that were actually made at the time, like Little Caesar and The Public Enemy.
Oh, I ain't forgetting all about the money.
Yeah, money's all right, but it ain't everything. Now, be somebody. Look hard at a bunch of guys and know that they'll do anything you tell them.
And listen, don't take any back talk from those speakies. Just tell them, here's the beer you ordered.
The use of accents and slang in a period piece setting have both been largely praised by fans, as they do help capture an atmosphere reminiscent of the anime's inspirations. However, there was no special accent training done for this project specifically. This isn't the full Monty of what was done with the Hellsing dub, so it all came down to the directing, the strength of the adaptive script, the uniqueness of each performance, or a combination of all of that.
What we report is neither unaffected information nor perceived information. It's the precursor to a conclusion.
After the opening, the very first frame of the entire series contains a book with an Ouroboros on the cover, the mythical snake eating its own tail. This could have been to foreshadow how the immortals gain knowledge by feeding on one another, or the general connection to alchemy. But it also acts as a mirror into the non-linear, self-referencing form of storytelling that the rest of the show will revel in. The original light novels are also non-linear, but only insofar as telling complete stories out of order, while the anime mangles them all together at once. Which, by the way, is something that also happens in gangster films from other parts of the world, like Pulp Fiction, Amores Perros, and The City of God. It's a series of glimpses into the lives of various characters, some of which have already had their own stories that led them to this point or will continue to have their stories told after the series is over. So it's very fortunate that Tyler was able to appreciate the show in its entirety before working on the dub, because while maybe not impossible, I'd imagine it'd be very difficult for the ADR team to fully plan out the specifics of their approach if they could only dub one episode at a time as it came out, especially since the source material wasn't available in English back then. You could argue that a more fast-paced and chaotic production might have produced a dub that would have been more in line with Baccano's sensibilities, which is what Tyler mentioned to us in an interview. But I suspect that would have led to decisions that were far safer by comparison, leading to a product that might have been closer to mirroring the original performances, while arguably at the expense of watering down a lot of the flourishes that caused this dub to stand out in the first place.
Aren't you the little play actor?
I don't know if you've noticed, but the boy could stand to be a bit more social.
Oh, they'll never get wise to it. It's gonna be a cinch. They're careless, but they've never been tapped.
As an information broker, there are very few facts of which we are not aware.
Baccano had probably one of the largest open audition processes of any other show at Funimation to this day. And while we can save the implications of that for a bigger conversation at another time, when talking about how it affected this show specifically, it's easier to get a sense that almost every performance has a very deliberate approach behind it.
What about the newspaper? What they gave us was less than nothing. They wouldn't give up anything on Dallas.
Again, there were a handful of performances that sounded silly even by this dub standards, but one of the great things about Baccano is that everyone in the show comes from different walks of life, yet no one really takes center stage amongst all the chaos, even when they arguably should, which is fitting for a show whose title can loosely translate as ruckus or commotion.
You know, some people, especially like Ladd, right? Like Ladd was very aware of pop culture and he was aware of his own, he had mythologized himself. I saw him as taking, you know, mannerisms and vernacular and kind of things from maybe the culture at the time, and he saw himself as this movie star, you know, larger than life gangster, and so some of the stuff he said was a little over the top.
Thank you! Fuck you! The star is here!
Crazy bastard.
What was that?
However, even if one of the points set up at the beginning is that the story doesn't really need to have a main character, it's not like the characters themselves would believe that, and the acting needs to reflect that sense of presence. So what better way to review good voice acting with a lot of presence than through the careful articulation of a good voice actor with way more presence than I will ever have.
Let's break it down. What went wrong? Everything went wrong. Yo, what's up? It's me, Sea-Dog, and today I'm on the Cartoon Cypher channel to help them review some voice acting in one of my favorite anime dubs of all time, Baccano. So in Japanese, a lot of them sound very smooth, very sleek, very reserved, and some characters are kinda close to that in the dub, like Dallas.
What'd you say?
My problem's with you.
He definitely sounds less aggressive and violent than the Japanese, but there's still a bit of gruffness to him. Plus, it's cool looking back on it because that was one of Ian Sinclair's earliest roles, and he went on to be fucking Space Dandy.
No one out-dandy Space Dandy.
But then Claire and Luck, pretty similar in both languages. There's some minor differences in texture and tone, and it's insane that they're played by the Japanese voices of Ichigo and Dio. Then there's Jacuzzi Splot.
Jacuzzi Splot.
Jacuzzi Splat! Jacuzzi Splat, okay!
Joel McDonald makes him sound a lot breathier and whinier and even younger. Like, it is impressive how that's clearly not Joel's natural voice, and he's probably doing this intentionally, but I get it, the voice can kinda suck the humor out of the moments where Jacuzzi just gets scared for no reason. In the dub, he sounds more nervous, cause he's just this sweet little boy who's just too innocent for the crime world. But in Japanese, he's more mature, but just naturally a sensitive guy.
The crying bothers us.
It's a nervous condition! It's not crying!
That nervous condition line was only in the dub. But by overdoing the fear and the shakiness in his voice, maybe dub Jacuzzi makes those moments where he's overcoming that fear more meaningful. And it's cute to see that this kid's totally losing his mind from the pressure, but he's still a goddamn hero when the time comes.
But who cares? For all the extra tears I've shed, I can just tell them that I was crying for you. So now no matter what you have to face, you won't need to cry because I've already done it for you.
In the dub, the way he's giving his voice a bit of extra timbre really makes you feel like this is the conclusion of his arc. It tells the audience everything he went through is leading up to this. This guy is about to risk his life. I think Joel's interpretation will definitely stick with you more, but it's debatable whether or not it sticks with you for the right reasons.
I told those jerks they should have got out of there! I know I told them!
There is one actor in the dub who plays two major characters, Jason Liebrecht. But he makes them nice and distinct, especially with their accents, so you probably won't notice. Speaking of which, the accents. They're important, and not just for the fact that they're there, but how they're used.
The Camorra is an organization born in the cell blocks of our mother country, Italy. When you choose this path, you have to be willing to suffer for us to exchange your freedom for imprisonment.
He is the son of Raymond Genowat, a man you took upon yourself to kill without any instructions from me. He also just happens to be the younger brother of another man you killed on your own named Jeffrey Genowat. You follow?
Then there's minor characters like Randy and Pezzo. Their accents are really pronounced.
No, you boob, you're using the wrong kind of gloves! Those ones are made out of cotton! What? Oh, I ain't it going!
Like you've got a canvas, right? You're painting with the sound, you know, and so you're building this world, you know, especially with something like this, you have the dialects. So the heavier ones may be more in the periphery and they build your world, and then the people who talk more may not be so over the top
Some characters were written in the original to be low-key and to want to deceive everyone, and the dub didn't give them these accents, like Rachel and Ches.
I can use these guys.
But you know what's really good? Characters like Miser, whose accent changes over time. Back in the 18th century, he's got an accent, and it works so well with his actor's warm, wholesome vocal quality.
The truth is that I am conflicted. I am afraid that I may be forced to devour Zilata.
And he sounds just as wholesome when he drops the accent in present day. It shows that he's moved on with his life.
Maybe someday I'll be able to tell you, Firo, but not right now.
Then there's Sillard, who sounds great, although his accent is this vaguely miscellaneous East European thing?
Yeah, just sort of generally Eastern European. I didn't pick a particular country.
Like he just stepped out of a Ghostbusters painting.
There you go, yeah. I don't understand the young people these days. Although I could never figure out what the young people of 200 years ago were thinking either.
But here's the thing, unlike Miser, he maintains that accent centuries later as a sign that he's still out for revenge from back then.
Miser. Since that young pup went mad, I haven't trusted anyone younger than me.
Like, I don't think they did anything like this in the Japanese version, but doing it in the dub adds a whole other layer that's still totally in line with how these characters were originally conceived.
What are you thinking, Miser? You're not going to share this knowledge?
Nobody else must ever know its secret. It's too powerful.
That is precisely why we must know how it is created.
Why are you so obsessed with the elixir?
It's quite simple. My one desire all these years has been the secret of the elixir you keep hidden.
You can feel that 200 years of bitterness between them just through their accents. It's so good. That doesn't mean that the characters are their accents. Baccano technically has no main character, but Isaac and Miria are probably the mascots for the show. Which is interesting, because they sound pretty different from the original.
For carelessness, there is no excuse.
No excuse for carelessness.
Isaac was higher pitched in the Japanese. A playful jokester like Vash the Stampede or Leron, who the Seiyu previously played.
あら、こっちはちょっと好みかも。つまりだ、俺たちの名前は歴史に残るんだぞ、ミリア。
J. Michael Tatum's English version is much lower and boomier, but it's still got a kind of springiness to it.
But that's okay, because you know what I saw outside of this abandoned mine? A centipede that had hundreds and hundreds of legs.
He's very careful where he puts his emphasis, so he sounds big and authoritative, even though most of his lines are nonsense. It's a lot closer to a dramatic radio announcer, but like with Jacuzzi, his motivations still feel largely the same as the Japanese, even though he sounds way different.
Both Isaac and Miria, that group, and Lad, I think definitely fictionalize themselves.
Yes.
Oh yeah, helps them.
Totally.
And almost anything is in character for them.
Yeah.
It's so,
that's
so
what's great
liberating.
about it. You don't have to
Anything.
You can kind of go wherever you want to with this. It's so funny.
And Michael really indulges himself in a musical tone, like he's a showman putting on a performance as the glorious star of his own life. Every line is a chance to show that off, especially in front of Miria, who always cheers along.
But I have guns, and I'm not afraid to use them if it'll help us make our daring escape.
Incredible!
Okay, so let's back it up a sec. In Japanese, Miria is played by Sayaka Aoki. She plays Cream the Rabbit from Sonic and Gion's sister from Haruhi. She does high-pitched, cutesy voices really, really well. In the dub, Caitlin Glass also makes her inflection go up near the end of the sentence, even though her voice isn't that high.
We're doing good now to make up for all the bad we've done!
Sometimes it feels like she's getting stuck between the squeakiness of the Seiyu and, well, sounding normal. Maybe they were going for an American mid-Atlantic accent back from the early 20th century films, where the women deliberately sounded more vulnerable and babyish. Think less of a cute Japanese mascot and more of a, oh my prince kind of vibe. Because in the Japanese, she has a rather special word. The dub adapts Sugoi as incredible, but also has her say it a bit less, which isn't the only thing that they dialed back in the dub. Generally, Japanese anime voiceover are very reaction heavy, and in Baccano 2, the seiyuu pretty often audibly go or to situations where it's just a very quiet gasp in the dub. Not to say that those types of sounds didn't have a place in other shows where they're kind of the point. Baccano's dub director also directed this. Baccano is also cartoony, but it's a different kind of cartoony. And by not using those kinds of stock reactions for the most part, it's possible you can make a more targeted or intentional move with them later on. After all, back then, one wrong move could easily get you killed.
Watch where you're going, will ya?
In the commentary track, they mention how Lad Russo is really just a big kid. Keiji Fujiwara is sadly no longer with us, but he was one of the most iconic voices in the entire industry, and he's given us some amazing performances in some of my favorite shows. So, to be clear, in both Japanese and English, Lad Russo is best waifu.
それでいいのかな?
お姉さんがベッドの中で教えてあげる。
その首を締め上げて締め上げて締め上げて締め上げて締め上げて泡吹いてもまだ締め上げて締め上げてメントが飛び出しそうになってもまだまだ締め上げて
You can hear his anger and frustration building with each line, like he just has to get all of this violence out of his body or he won't know what to do with himself. In the dub, Brian Massey will also smooth up the intensity of his tone without needing to raise his voice, but it sounds less like he's angry and more like he's actively straining himself to find the strength needed to crush this guy's throat.
And then take them by the throat and squeeze and squeeze and squeeze until they foam like a dog and then squeeze some more. When their eyes are about to pop out, you squeeze just a little more.
The exhaustion is realistic, yet you never lose that sense of enjoyment Lad is clearly taking from this action. And it's just beautiful in a violent, self-gratifying way.
Right?
This scene is actually the one that determined Brian would be cast as Lad, and for a good reason.
Yeah, I tried that at a commercial audition. It didn't go the same way.
His voice is obviously much gruffer, but Lad is a rough around the edges kind of guy, and the dub really pushes that more with the tone. But the performance itself comes off more like a kid in a candy store. In Japanese, I think the fear comes from how someone could sound very well put together, but just love violence so much.
If you don't fancy being killed by us, you can always jump off and die.
While the dub makes his love of violence more open and even playful.
Nice try, Slugger.
Here, Japanese Lad starts very calm and collected, slowly building up his energy as the scene goes on. While in English, Lad leans more on the physicality of the boxing.
Come on, put up your dukes. You think you're Pete Hammond? You're like Jack Dempsey. Or maybe Jack Johnson. You've got no technique. Do you even know any of these boxes I'm talking about?
The way Fujiwara spits out these really fast lines makes him sound evil and bloodthirsty, like a savage killer who's progressively savoring the moment. Massey draws out his delivery with more shouting right from the offset.
Any red-blooded American would know who I'm talking about, right? Don't tell me you don't. Oh, you don't? I'll make you pay for not knowing them, pal!
He goes in on every line with the punch, and similarly on the choking scene. You can feel the exhaustion in his voice grow. Combined with Lad's constant maniacal laughing, it just pairs well that this fucking guy is insane in English.
Of course, even if you did, you'd still have to pay!
While the Japanese version sounds more disappointed, the dub goes for a more condescending and playful tone.
So you're still conscious, huh, pal? I guess I have to work on my right hook.
The way he pitches his voice around to really rub it in that he could have hit harder.
You think you're so smart!
He's absolutely fucking insane, like a child playing with his toys. Even if it's different, it's still a real masterclass in vocal control.
You are my absolute favorite people to kill! You are so beautifully amazed when you die! Especially when I squish your brain between my fingers like I'm making sausage!
A lot of how the characters in this dub speak or present themselves is dictated by the specific visuals on screen, as opposed to the timing of the original dialogue. While Baccano has fantastic character designs, the character animation quality is inconsistent, which impacted how the dub matched the flaps. Most of the time it's trying to fill in the flaps more closely than the original voice acting did, like when Dallas starts yelling before his mouth opens in the Japanese version. Even small things like grunts and reactions are retimed more precisely. It can be the difference between this and this.
God have mercy!
It's not that this isn't uncommon for Japanese dubs, even for modern anime.
なんか海外旅行のパンフレットみたいだよな。
全ての女性が共感し。
But Baccano has some of the most bizarre cases of mismatched dialogue I've ever seen. Take this moment here, where Isaac's voice is coming out of Miria's mouth in the Japanese dub.
でも私たちそんなに大金持ちになれるの？
なれるさ。俺はミリアと一緒なら大統領にだってなれる。
Really think we're gonna be that rich, Isaac?
But of course!
Oh, it's gonna be so incredible!
As long as we're together, I could be the president, I could be a king or a queen, I could even be a...
Now, we haven't seen every dub made in every region, but generally I feel like dubs from Texas lean closer to a visuals are king approach, which can result in more, quote, realistic sound direction, and not just limited to flaps either. Some key scenes take place outside or on top of a moving train, where realistically it would be difficult to hear anything.
Alright guys, up there!
The deliveries of the seiyuu sound pretty much normal, but the dub has them try to shout and speak over their surroundings.
一つ前の連結部で待ってて。任せろ。黒服にはくれぐれも気をつけてね。行こう。Johnny, you go through the car and wait for us in the next coupling. You got that?
No problem.
Hey, watch out for the guys in black suits, okay?
Right.
Let's go!
Nathaniel Harrison was the lead mix engineer for the dub, but Tyler couldn't remember who suggested this approach. Sometimes those decisions could arise from the staff being out of touch with the intentions of the material, while other times the staff might seek to add in elements that they think would have been there if the original actors and mixers got to see the final product. Most of the time, foreign dubbers have the benefit of appreciating an episode's final animation and mix before recording. So if the staff notice something that takes them out of the scene in the moment, sometimes it's worth deciding whether or not such a thing was intentional or a consequence of a complicated anime production cycle. When I asked Tyler, he said, I can suspend my disbelief and accept those guys are wizards or immortal or whatever, but I cannot believe they heard anything that person said over the noise. This probably isn't something fans notice or even care about when watching the sub version, but we can understand why this would be considered immersion breaking.
Some may say it's a good change, others may say it's a bad change.
I am too stupid to have an opinion.
On the one hand, recontextualizing certain elements can lead to situations where the same idea could be communicated in different ways. In episode 8, Isaac tries to cheer Jacuzzi up by comparing him to one of the figures in Romance of the Three Kingdoms. In the original, he tells Jacuzzi to be like Yoshitsune, who, incidentally, was not a character in the story he's referencing. And the joke is supposed to be that Isaac, once again, has no idea what he's talking about amongst all the theatrics despite his well-meaning intentions. However, in the dub, the name Yoshitsune was swapped for Billy the Kid, and this change could serve a few purposes.
In the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Cao Cao and Billy the Kid killed thousands, millions, billions of guys! That didn't stop people from thinking they were great guys, and so the only conclusion is that they must have been great guys!
The most obvious one being that, by replacing the punchline with something that leans more towards what an American audience would understand, you're able to better sell the type of joke that's being communicated. It's possible that Americans might not even know that Yoshitsune had nothing to do with the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. I sure as hell didn't.
I could see how that would be misleading.
But even without knowing that story, referencing Billy the Kid instead makes it apparent that Isaac isn't the sharpest tool in the shed, and couldn't put all of his random knowledge together in a coherent way. Granted, there might have been better Western equivalents to Yoshitsune that would have highlighted Jakuzi's specific struggle, but while it is a change, it's not a complete deviation from the spirit of the original intention. Due to the specific setting, the other few added Western references in this dub actually feel less out of place than the ones in the Fooly Cooly dub, or even the subtitles for Parasite. But while that does set it apart from some other dubs, there's still the argument that such an approach is unnecessary. While the series does take place in a Western setting, it's still being appreciated through a Japanese lens, so the absence of more appropriate mannerisms can be seen as respectful. Plus, even if a lot of those anime-ish reaction sounds could be considered stock, the seiyuu do help elevate the believability of the given emotions.
Oh, uncle?
There's also this one background character who compares dominoes to shogi pieces in the original, only to have that altered to reminiscing about the old country with an Italian accent. Granted, that character's story is never delved into, and when I asked Tyler, he admitted he's not sure he would approach something like that the same way again. In some ways, it's understandable why people might feel that the original version of Baccano deserves more recognition, especially when there are those who might dismiss it offhand just because an English dub for this anime with a non-Japanese setting exists, and nothing more. Even when it comes to lip flaps, there's an argument to be made that, while the dub did fix some glaring technical errors, the original sounds were opportunities for characterizations that were missed out on. Whether it's Dallas's anger, Jakuzi's fear, or even Greto's final word being his girlfriend's name. Maybe this isn't a huge deal, as the dub writes the characters consistently with the original version for the rest of the show anyway, but sound direction isn't 100% about realism.
ヒューイ・ラフォレット様とやらの一番のお気に入りで、お前もその信者なんだってな。
You're the personal prized possession of a guy called Huey LaForêt, and you believe in him fanatically!
Granted, the Baccano dub didn't go nearly as far with changing the sound direction as, say, the first Evangelion dub. However, there's still the potential that the two are communicating different experiences to different audiences at times.
Not only will it sow discord among enemies, but also among people who love each other very much.
Baccano has been one of the community's favorite dubs for a long time, and having looked back on it, it's clear that there's a lot more to this English adaptation outside of it just existing.
It's funny, isn't it? The way people bump into each other.
Maybe every encounter is some sort of miracle in its own way.
Don't you think that's just a little bit random?
Yeah, a little too random for me.
It'd be a shame if some people use the dubs they like to dismiss the original by default. That's definitely a mistake I've made in an earlier video. It's better to acknowledge those meaningful differences rather than pretend they aren't there at all. Because not only is it good to appreciate the original audio that laid the groundwork, but it's also important to appreciate the efforts that went into bringing this amazing world to a new audience.
Just please, remember me.
The directing, the performances, the adaptive writing, they didn't just come from the setting. They came from people. People who at the time saw the potential of this story.
Stories never begin, nor do they end. They are comprised of people living, an endless cycle of interacting, influencing each other, and parting ways.
We can start off as friends, but you think you could fall in love with me?
As to whether it holds up right now, there's obviously some things that wouldn't be done nowadays, and some areas for improvement. But from what I've heard people say, it remains something that inspires both fans and staff alike as to what dubbing could be, seeing a story as a unique entity, and trying to enrich it while being careful not to subtract too much. Obviously that doesn't always work, but you don't know until you try. If you've avoided the original audio for Baccano because it doesn't match the setting, maybe give it a shot. And if you have some predispositions to watching dubs, maybe this one will give you a different idea. After all, Baccano is an anime that constantly retells itself from different perspectives. A story that never began, and a story that never ended.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, go and subscribe to my YouTube channel, CDogVA, and my podcast, Trash Taste. Thanks for having me, guys. I love your work. It was a pleasure.
Hey everyone, Eric here, and we hope you enjoyed this video on the English dub of Baccano. Huge thanks to Connor from CDogVA for taking the time to join us and talking about one of his favorite dubs of all time. Be sure to check out his channel if you want to see him review more good and bad voice acting. With further thanks going to Tyler Walker for sharing his insight on this dub's production. We really couldn't have done this without either of you, and in fact, I did an interview with Tyler a couple of months ago that ended up being the basis for this video. So if you're curious at all about that, be sure to check it out in the card up top. Special thanks to our patrons who continue to support us, including Reagan Senpai, Marissa Lenti, Spartacus, JR Pictures, Ahoba, Seth Phillips, Unknown Secret 1000, and Queen Era 2. If you like this video, share it around, leave a thumbs up, give us your thoughts and opinions on the English dub in the comments down below, and be sure to ring that bell icon so you can be notified on our next video. You know, assuming that YouTube feels like working. This has been the Cartoon Cypher, and until next time.